morning. My name is Eric McGhee, and I'm a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Thanks for tuning into our virtual program today. Hopefully, by this time next year, we will no longer be virtual, crossing fingers, but for now, we are still virtual. And we're going to be looking at the findings of our new report, Vote by Mail and Voter Turnout in the Pandemic Election. This report is co-authored with Jennifer Pollack at PPIC and Minnie Romero at the Center for Inclusive Democracy. The report and the technical appendix, as well as the slides from today's presentation, are available on our website at ppic.org. And I'd like to thank the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for supporting this virtual event. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation. We also don't support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office, so it's just important to note that up front. And for today's program, I'll walk you through some of the key findings of the report that we just released. And after the presentation, I'll answer any audience questions that people might have. If you have a question about anything at all, but specifically about the report, would be great. I'll be more likely to be able to answer that. So please submit those questions to PPIC event questions, all one word, at gmail.com. So again, PPIC event questions at gmail.com. All right, now let me navigate to my slides. So this report looks at vote by mail policy in the pandemic election, and specifically in California. We saw in the 2020 election a sudden set of risks involved in just a simple act of voting. So voting is not normally a terribly risky endeavor, but suddenly showing up in person at a polling place risked viral transmission. Furthermore, the people who worked those polling sites, the poll workers, were going to be exposed to a lot of voters throughout the day, and so they had an especially high risk. That meant, number one, that it might be hard to get people to turn out to vote in the first place, and number two, it might be hard to staff the normal number of in-person options because it'd be hard to get volunteers willing to staff those sites. The solutions generally involved less in-person voting. So most states encouraged more voting by mail. In California specifically, we mailed every voter a vote by mail ballot, every active voter. And then we had a series of county options for in-person voting that were kind of within a certain set of boundaries set by the state. The state also is considering making some of these changes permanent. Specifically, the decision to mail every voter a vote by mail ballot with AB 37. The state has also decided to continue with the same basic approach through the end of this calendar year, including for any recall that might happen at the end of the year. So we look at what the effects of these decisions were on, first and foremost, total turnout, and then secondarily on the ballot rejection rate, how often vote by mail ballots that were submitted were rejected for one reason or another. So we're going to start by looking at the diversity of policy options that states adopted during 2020, and there's a lot of diversity in policy approaches. Then we're going to kind of just get the lay of the land in terms of the turnout, like what the patterns of turnout were that we saw both nationally and in California. Then we will wrestle with how to identify the actual effect of the vote by mail policy as distinct from all the other things that were going on in 2020 and what we find in that respect. What was the actual impact of the vote by mail policy itself? And then we'll wrap up with some conclusions and policy recommendations. So the most extraordinary thing about 2020, of course, was the pandemic. From kind of an election geek perspective, the second most extraordinary thing was all of the policy changes that happened all over the country, especially with related to vote by mail. Just a tremendous range of experimentation that occurred that would not normally have occurred in an election season. So 9 states removed restrictions on signing up to voting by mail. 15 states mailed every voter a vote by mail application to try and encourage them to sign up to vote by mail. That was a real policy innovation that had almost never been tried before 2020. It's very rare. And then 7 states and Washington, D.C. mailed every voter an actual ballot. So you didn't even have to sign up to vote by mail. You just got one of those ballots in the mail by default. And California was one of those states. Within California, as I mentioned before, the state took a wide range of approaches to in-person voting. So again, mailed every voter a ballot so they could vote that ballot if they wanted to. But there were also some in-person voting. System continued in 16 counties where they just really didn't make much change to how they administer the elections. They figured they could get enough people to staff those traditional locations. 7 counties consolidated their polling places into sort of super precincts, but still made those polling places accessible only to people in a particular neighborhood, but like you would have with a traditional polling place. 17 counties consolidated, and then they made the polling places that they consolidated accessible to anyone in the county. So that's a bit of an innovation. They had the ability to identify which ballot everybody was supposed to be voting. And then the Voters' Choice Act was actually a reform that had been implemented prior to the pandemic in 15 counties, and they continued with that approach in the fall with a few slight modifications. It's an approach that is very similar to the one right above it, the consolidated polling places accessible to anyone in the county. So it's these larger professionally staffed vote centers that anybody in the county can go to and provide a range of voting related services. The Voters' Choice Act counties also had already committed to mailing every voter a ballot before the state decided to do it statewide. So those two can kind of be thought of as very similar to each other, even though they're a little bit distinct in some respects. And then 3 counties actually had been all vote by mail with no polling places since before the pandemic. Three very rural counties. Okay, so what did we see in terms of state and national turnout in this pandemic election? Just kind of a general sense. Well, I think it's no secret. Most people know that there was a huge turnout increase. So that first number there is the share of eligible voters, those who are citizens and 18 or over, who voted in 2016. That second number is the same in 2020. You can see a big 7 percentage point increase. That's huge in kind of in the turnout world. There was even a larger increase in California specifically. So California saw an even bigger bump than the average state. And perhaps not surprisingly, there was a huge increase in mail ballot use in California. California was already a state that had very high mail ballot use, but it surged more than it had historically, all the way up to 86.7%. So a big change there as well. This plot shows a few different categories of approaches to the 2020 election and how they relate to the change in turnout between 2016 and 2020. So we're showing everything in terms of change here. So on the far left, these are states that made no change to any of the categories of vote by mail policy that we look at. So they didn't. They might be states that had a really friendly approach to voting by mail, even mailing voters a ballot, like Oregon. It could be states that all the way to states that required an excuse to vote by mail and continue to require that excuse. So no change there. The next category over, the relaxed excuse policy, are those states that decided, okay, for the sake of 2020 at least, we're going to remove the requirement that you provide an excuse for signing up for vote by mail. Then the next one over from that is the states that decided in 2020 to send every voter a vote by mail, an application to sign up for voting by mail. And then on the far right is the ones that decided for the first time for the first presidential election to send every voter a ballot. The only thing that really kind of stands out in this plot is that this sending every voter a ballot category tends to have higher average turnout than the other categories. Otherwise, it's not clear kind of that there's a consistent difference just in this sort of simple look at the data. This is within California. Now, just looking at the counties in California and categorizing them by their approach to the in-person voting in 2020. So we have the three all-mail ballot counties on the far left, then traditional polling place counties, ones that didn't make any switch in that respect, the ones that consolidated their polling places, but still required people to go to a specific one in their neighborhood, the ones that consolidated but allowed for countywide access, and then the vote center counties. And what we see in this plot is really, first of all, you notice that almost all of these points are above that zero line, which suggests that they saw an increase in turnout. That's consistent with the plot I just showed before that suggested there was higher turnout in those all mail ballot counties. Because remember, every single one of these counties by definition is an all mail ballot county in 2020. And then beyond that, there really isn't a whole lot of pattern here. We see kind of the points in all the different categories are sort of in the same range of each other. And that'll be kind of a consistent finding throughout as well. All right, so how do we take the next step and say whether these vote by mail policies had some effect? Well, we got to wrestle with a lot of different things that were going on. First of all, if we're looking at mail ballot access specifically, so this question of mailing an application to voters, removing the excuse requirement for signing up, mailing everybody a ballot, those kinds of things. Excuse me. Then the comparison we need is really a national one, because basically every county in California took the same approach. So we really want to go beyond California's borders and look at the effect, comparing states, excuse me, that made this change to states that did not. And so when we do that, we can start to account for a lot of different things that were going on at the same time. First of all, other policy changes, especially automatic voter registration, which was adopted by many of the states that made switches in their vote by mail policy. So we want to sort of account for that in our analysis. The COVID caseload, what was COVID a serious problem in a particular county leading up to the election, or was it not quite as serious a problem? The competitiveness of the state in the presidential election, which can really influence how many people turn out to vote. The overall 2020 turnout surge that we saw, we have already talked about. Permanent differences between counties and between states, the kinds of things that, maybe states and counties that were already kind of high turnout counties or high turnout states decided to make the change, right? We want to account for that as well. And then the kind of, also finally, the turnout trends before 2020. So were these counties seeing an increase in turnout or a decrease in turnout leading into 2020? We want to account for that as well. So when we throw all that in the mix, here's what we get in terms of an estimate of the overall effect of these reforms. So the top one here is for mailing all voters a ballot. And we see about a 4%. So then, and on the right is prior to 2020. Oops. Is prior to 2020. On the left is in 2020 itself. So prior to 2020, we saw about a 4% change from making that switch to mailing all voters a ballot. That's a pretty big effect in the turnout world. In 2020, it was about the same, a little bit, maybe just a smidge higher, which is remarkable given all of the other things going on. We also were sort of able to estimate what it would be for a hypothetical county that had no vote by mail voters prior to the switch. How big? So it's kind of if you think of it as the impact of the switch to mailing all voters a ballot for those voters most likely to see the change, right? And what we see is about a pretty substantial increase of almost 10% before and about the same after. The next line down is for the removing excuses for signing up or voting by mail. So just allowing people to sign up if they want to. And before that, before 2020, it was about a 1 percentage point increase, not a huge increase, but something. In 2020, it actually was a little bit of a decline, which is interesting. The mailing all voters a vote by mail application, which is this kind of interesting innovation. Again, there were really essentially no counties. So this effect from before 2020 is, can take with a grain of salt, but it was small. After or during 2020, it was, larger. It was almost 2 percentage points, but not as big as the effect of mailing every voter a ballot. The next thing we look at is within California, looking at that sort of how the counties approach the in-person voting. And again, we have to account for a lot of different things: the turnout surge, the permanent differences between counties, the trends, and then we also look here at the number of drop boxes and in-person voting locations that that counties used. And so all of our estimates here are compared to the counties that didn't make any change. So the polling place, traditional polling place, and the all vote by mail counties. And what we see is the two approaches that allowed voters to use any location in the county tended to have about the same increase. Again, it's not, if you look over here at the margin of error, it's not very statistically precise. So we can't say this was 1.5 percentage points with a whole lot of confidence. But nonetheless, for what it's worth, it was a little bit of an increase. And again, keep in mind that this is on top of the other increases that we just saw, the 4% from mailing every voter a ballot. The neighborhood only access was there really wasn't any change from kind of a traditional, maybe just a smidge negative, right? But these are all very statistically uncertain, so we should state them with caution. And finally, we looked at the ballot rejection rate. Overall, the rejection rate went down just a little bit. So this is now, remember, the ballots that were sent in that didn't get counted for one reason or another. Usually it's because either they came in too late or because the signature on the ballot didn't match the signature on the file. And what we see is, first of all, that overall in the state as a whole, that rejection rate went down just a little tiny bit, which is remarkable given how many more people were voting by mail. And then when we look at it categorized by the different categories of in-person voting, we don't see a lot of pattern here. And we see that it's the same kind of thing if we look at the number of drop boxes and the number of in-person voting locations. Just not a lot of variation there. Really kind of, if there was a change, it was kind of an overall average statewide change, which suggests it was probably an overall average statewide policy that that produced the result, if anything did. In our policy recommendations, in terms of conclusions, the most consistently positive effect that we find is mailing all voters a ballot, which is what California is already doing and is currently debating continuing doing. Other policies on access to voting by mail have less effect. That can kind of vary some depending on how you're measuring it. The most positive effect among the in-person policies within California was countywide access for the in-person location. But it's worth noting that it is a smaller effect and it's more kind of statistically ambiguous. In terms of rejection rates, they were marginally better in 2020 than in 2016. But it was probably, if anything, a statewide policy and not a local county level policy. What might that statewide policy be? Well, the state moved out the deadline for receiving a ballot to 17 days after election day. So as long as you mailed your ballot by election day, it could take 17 days to get to its destination. So that may have helped. The state also adopted a statewide vote by mail ballot tracking system for the first time. So that may have had some impact. We aren't able, with the data that we have, to disentangle all those different things, except to say that it was probably some kind of statewide thing. So in terms of policy recommendations, if your goal is to increase turnout, mailing a ballot to every voter is probably accomplishes most of the turnout benefits. One of the advantages of what we're doing here is the ability to distinguish, to separate out the increase from mailing a ballot from the increase from the sort of consolidation of polling places and so forth. And it's probably mailing a ballot that makes the most difference. The other policy choices, maybe make some difference, but are more ambiguous. We want to note that the study doesn't have any conclusions about and didn't look at two important things. First, the administrative benefits or costs of these reforms. There's arguments one way or the other on those. We don't look at that in this particular report. The other crucial caveat is we don't look at equity effects. So we're not looking here at whether any of these changes had any impact on the representativeness of the electorate and whether it encouraged more turnout from underrepresented groups like people of color and young people. That's a really important and crucial policy question, but we don't have the data yet to answer it. We're hoping to have those data soon. All right, so as I said at the beginning, the email address for submitting your questions is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And thank you for listening. And I'm kind of open up the floor to any questions people might have. All right. So one question, can you share your thoughts on last week's special election for a state assembly seat in San Diego? Turnout was at just 21% of registered voters, despite every voter receiving a ballot in the mail. Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the challenge with special elections is that each one is special, right? So it's a little hard to say what the implications are for this particular reform. We were looking at turnout in a general election and especially turnout in a presidential general election. So we have actually looked at the turnout effects of the Voters' Choice Act reform in other kinds of elections and found that it still does have it still does boost turnout overall. But in terms of any given special election, there's so many other factors that are going to be involved. It would be very hard to say that this told you anything one way or the other about the role of mailing voters a ballot. Okay, so in California counties with lower permanent VBM rates, such as LA, what was the impact on turnout? Was the impact on turnout greater than in the counties with higher rates? Yeah, so the answer to that is we didn't look at that question specifically within California, but we did look at it kind of in a national context. Part of the challenge with looking at that specifically within California is that the turnout rates, the vote by mail rates were actually even in a county like LA were pretty high from a sort of national perspective. But in that national analysis, for sure, as a county had fewer vote by mail voters before the transition, the impact of the reform was greater. So I haven't looked specifically at LA's number, but it would be consistent with that result if LA saw a particularly large turnout increase. Could you speak to any connection between boosting voter turnout and the other major outreach effort now underway distributing vaccines? For instance, are there any lessons about getting to hard to reach groups? Can voter registration rules be used to inform vaccine strategy and outreach? So that's a very interesting question. And I'm not sure I know quite how to answer it. I mean, they do seem like sort of different messages. One of the challenges with the vaccines is getting people to trust the vaccines. One of the challenges of voter outreach is getting people to connect sort of their own personal circumstance to the voting process and the voting experience, and to sort of see themselves as empowered to make a change. I guess there's a sort of trust issue there as well. But I also I don't know as you would really want to use the voter registration rolls. I guess it is a list of people, but you know, some of the hardest to reach and most disadvantaged groups are not going to be on the registration rolls, and you want them to be vaccinated too. So I don't know if that would be a good strategy or not. It's a very interesting question, though. Okay, yeah. So there's the New York Times citing a Stanford study said no excuse absentee voting only increased turnout by 0.2%. So the study that this question is referencing looked specifically at turnout in Texas. And so what Texas did a kind of interesting thing with its voting by mail, that it's not the only state that did this, but it had a rule where if you were 65 and older, you could vote by mail if you wanted to. If you were younger than 65, you couldn't. And so what those researchers did was compare the people who were, say, 63, 64 to people who were 65, 66, and see if there was a difference there, with the argument being there's not going to be a lot of other differences between those folks, except that they had access to vote by mail. And so, you know, that's a really good, from a researcher perspective, that's a really good research design for figuring out the effect, but it's going to be very specific to that population. And you could think for all kinds of reasons why that population, why people who are 64 and 63, 64 are going to be pretty likely to turn out. Anyway, older people tend to be more likely to vote. But you know, I would say that that finding that it's a small or non-existent in the case of that report effect is kind of broadly consistent with what we find, but we're looking at a sort of larger data set that covers the whole country. PPIC has been looking closely at voting reform and vote by mail in recent years. What surprised you about your findings? Yeah, that's a good question. I think the thing that surprised me personally the most was really how robust the mailing every voter a ballot approach was, and then, you know, within, like, in terms of trying to figure out the impact on those voters who had not been vote by mail before, was that larger or smaller? And to have that be so much larger, you know, there had been at least one other study that had looked at it that way, but I thought it was really interesting to see that magnitude and to see it replicated in 2020. And I think, sort of just following on that last point, the fact that it really had such a similar effect in 2020 and as it had before 2020 was surprising to me. I was expecting the pandemic election to change a lot more of the dynamics of these things than it perhaps did. Has California ever considered allowing online voting, and do you think it should? I think that it's often something that people talk about. It actually it came up just in an event with Secretary Weber that we had last week. That question, I think it's a good question. My own personal feeling is that it's just super tough to do online voting in a way that's secure. It raises all kinds of challenges with security, and after the 2016 election, with the meddling from Russia and so forth, I think it should raise even more red flags, because if somebody could hack into that system and all the voting was online, boy, you can do a lot of mischief. And you know, people often say, well, it's just like you can do online banking, and banking is about money, and money is something you have to be really secure about. That is true, but money is also sort of fungible. You can, if you lose some money here, you can replace it with some other money over there. It's not great. It's not fun to lose money, but it can be sort of moved around that way. Votes are votes, and they are, once you've cast that vote, it can't be connected back to the person who cast it because it's a secret ballot, and so it's very hard to know sort of what the original intent was and to replace that ballot in any meaningful sense. So it's I just think it's something that, you know, my experience with election security experts and computer science experts on this subject is that they are all terrified of the idea of online voting. So the very people who you would think would be most pro-technology in this case are really, they say it's not a good idea. So 2020 was a high interest election in general. Given the presidential election, how does your study account for the fact that interest at the state level may vary? For instance, with certain states having, say, competitive governor's races or other hot button issues. That's also a very good question. And that's actually one of the nice things about working with the presidential election is that in the context of a presidential election, the competitiveness of that presidential election overwhelms pretty much everything else that is going on. You might see some effects at the margins from other types of races. So we do account for the competitiveness of the presidential contest in each state, but the kinds of variation in turnout you would see from special elections, for instance, depending on what the issue is on the ballot, from a gubernatorial election in a given state in a given year that's not a part of a presidential election. That variation is going to be a lot less in a presidential election when the presidential contest really overwhelms so many other things. Is there a role that federal policy can play in boosting vote by mail or voter turnout at the state level? I think there is, in the sense that there is actually a bill in Congress to HR 1, which would mandate a lot of these policies. It would mandate a lot more vote by mail for federal elections. So Congress in the Constitution has this explicit authority to regulate federal elections. And it would be the HR 1 would be using that authority to make these changes. It's a huge bill. It includes a lot of things. It also includes some campaign finance reform, some redistricting reform. It includes automatic voter registration. It has a whole bunch of things in there. And right now, its prospects are maybe looking a little dicey. But that would be a way that the federal government could step in and sort of mandate a more uniform approach. And as long as the election was held, a state's election was held coincident with a federal election, those restrictions would apply. So you just have to have some federal candidates on the ballot, and then those restrictions would be enforceable. It doesn't really apply to California, because California has already, unless California decides not to sort of step back from the kind of vanguard position it's in right now, it really has taken a very sort of bleeding edge approach to a lot of these reforms, and has adopted a whole bunch of a whole bunch of voting access reforms all kind of at the same time that have put it sort of at the place where HR 1 already would want it to be. And so there really isn't a role unless there was some effort at the federal level to pull things back from where California is. What comes next in terms of research? So the presentation flagged some questions about equity. Yes, that's an excellent question. We are planning to do research on the equity question, on whether these reforms have helped make California's electorate more representative. I think that's in many ways the important question. And we are hoping to have data for that really soon. And we're planning on releasing a report this fall that will look at that question. So stay tuned if you're interested in that, that follow-on question. We also have some thoughts about doing other things on sort of automatic voter registration and stuff, but it's a little bit more in the planning stages. All right. I think that's all the questions that we have in the queue. Maybe I'll wait just a second to see if anybody else has any questions they wanted to ask. Sort of last chance. This is the time when in person I could kind of scan the audience, but Now I have to just show you this slide with the email address. Yeah, so I think, oh, there's maybe one more. They look at party or no party preference differences. Not in this report. My co-authors and I did a paper that we're going to present at the Midwest Political Science Association conference this Saturday that did look at the partisan impacts of some of these reforms and basically concluded that there's no reliable partisan impact from any of these changes. And if anything, in 2020, there may have been even a slight benefit to Republicans from some of these changes, though not to the extent where I would, be willing to go to the Republican Party and tell them that they should adopt all these reforms just for that reason. So I think there was a lot of conversation in 2020 around the potential partisan implications of these reforms, going all the way up to the president himself. I think that is the wrong way to think about these reforms. I think for both parties, if either party is thinking that they should adopt these things because it's going to give them some kind of permanent advantage in elections, I think that's just the absolute wrong way to think about it. I think you have to think about it in terms of the broader principle of whether you want more people to participate or not. That's how I think, that's for me personally, that's how I believe these should be approached. And the partisan question, I think, is you're barking up the wrong tree if you want to worry about that. And the answer clearly is that some of them do. Some of them have kind of small effects, but some of them do have some larger effects on turnout, specifically mailing every voter a ballot in the case of the report that we released here today. Well, the equity research look at language access. The answer is I'm not sure yet. That's not something that's universally available everywhere. It is in California, and so we might be able to look at it in the context of California, but it's kind of yet to be determined. But it's certainly an important question is language, the turnout and equity for language access communities, for sure. Did you look at subgroup turnout rates in a full vote by mail election? The answer is not yet. So that's to come. We have looked at it in the context of the Voters' Choice Act. So Mindy Romero, my co-author, with Thad Kauser and Laura Daly, we did a study a couple of years ago now, I think, that did look at the equity issue from the standpoint of the Voters' Choice Act specifically. As a reminder, the Voters' Choice Act, mail everybody a ballot, have these sort of consolidated, professionally operated vote centers that people can access for a variety of services. And that study, which was, again, was based on some very preliminary evidence, so I take it with a grain of salt, but there wasn't really any effect one way or the other that we could identify on the representation question, so the representativeness of the electorate. So it was the gap in turnout between underrepresented groups and others really didn't improve or get particularly worse under the VCA. It was kind of the same. But we'll stay tuned because we're going to be looking at that with a whole lot more data, if all goes well, and be able to have hopefully a little bit clearer answer on that question. Do you expect greater turnout with all mail ballot elections in the midterms or more local elections? Yes, I do. I mean, just in general, I would expect that mail ballot, that the act of mailing a ballot does increase turnout. And you always have to think about, with these questions of whether something causes something, you always have to think about what's sort of the counterfactual, like what are we comparing it to? Like what's the, we have to find something that some situation that is identical in every other respect, but didn't have everybody mail the ballot. And that can be challenging in some cases, like I was mentioning earlier with the special elections. It can be really challenging to know sort of what would the special election have looked like if we didn't mail everybody a ballot, because everybody was mailed the ballot, right? And there was such a sort of that election was so special and was unique in so many different ways. So I do expect that it would have that effect on average over time. And we'll just have to see, but that would be if it had the effect that we saw in a really high profile presidential election, when people have the highest level of motivation to turn out to vote, then I would expect that it would have at least as large an effect in a lower salience election. Other questions? PPIC event questions at gmail.com. We have about 5 minutes still, if people wanted to ask something else. Okay, well, I guess since we're kind of close to the end anyway, maybe we'll wrap it up there. I really appreciate everybody coming today. I think that's the wrapping up part of these virtual events is always a little bit ambiguous, but again, thanks to everybody for coming. If you one point is, if you did pre-register for this event, then later today you should receive a survey, and I hope that you'll take a couple of minutes to let us know how we did. It's okay to give criticism. That helps us just as much as compliments, though I love the compliments too. So everyone be safe, go out and get vaccinated if you haven't, and if you get the chance to, and have a wonderful rest of your morning, the 18 minutes that are left of it, and a wonderful afternoon.